She had 5 children, no money, and a town full of people who'd already decided she didn't belong. When Evelyn Harper walked through the gates of the most powerful ranch in Redstone Crossing, not with a hat in her hand, not with tears on her face, but with her chin up and a demand on her lips, every person who saw it either laughed or went quiet with something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. They didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to beg. Neither did Wade Callahan. And that was only the beginning of the problem. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Stay until the end. And drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon wheel cracked somewhere outside of Millbrook, and that was the last thing that went right for 3 days. Evelyn Harper didn't cry about it. She climbed down from the seat, assessed the damage with the kind of flat expression that comes not from toughness, but from exhaustion so deep it had burned through all the softer emotions first, and told her oldest boy to get the axle pin from the toolbox under the seat. "It's not in there," Thomas said. He was 14. Lean and already developing the habit of delivering bad news in the same tone other people use to report the weather. "Look again." "Mama, Thomas." She said his name the way she always said it when she needed him to stop arguing and start moving. Not loud, not sharp, just final. He looked again. The pin wasn't there. They camped by the side of the road for 2 nights, while she and Thomas fashioned a replacement from a length of iron she'd been keeping in the back of the wagon since Harlan died, a leftover piece from a fence repair he'd planned but never started. She'd almost sold it twice during the hard months after the funeral. She was glad now that she hadn't. The 5 children ranged from Thomas at 14 down to little May, who was 4 and had recently developed the habit of narrating everything she observed at full volume. "The wheel is broken," May announced, standing beside the wagon and pointing at the obvious. "Yes, it is," Evelyn said. "Are we going to die here?" "No. Papa died." Evelyn stopped what she was doing. She didn't look at May right away. She looked at the iron in her hands, at the dirt under her fingernails, at the pale afternoon sky above the scrubby roadside trees. Then she looked at her youngest daughter, who was watching her with big brown eyes that held genuine curiosity and very little understanding of what she'd just said. "We are not going to die here," Evelyn said. "Come help me hold this." May held the iron. It was too heavy for her, and she struggled, but she held it. That was 3 days before Redstone Crossing. By the time the wagon rolled down the main street of town, Evelyn had been awake for the better part of 36 hours. Her second daughter, Clara, had a cough that worried her, and the oldest girl, Ruth, who was 12, had stopped talking almost entirely, which was either a sign of maturity or a sign that something inside her was closing off, and Evelyn hadn't had time yet to find out which. Her youngest boy, Henry, was 8 and had recently decided he was old enough to walk alongside the wagon rather than ride in it, a decision Evelyn allowed because arguing about it cost more energy than it saved. They made quite a sight, she supposed, rolling into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon. A worn-down wagon, a swayback horse that had been middle-aged when Harlan bought him and was now something past that. 5 children in various states of road dust and tiredness. A woman alone on the driver's seat with straight posture that was, at this point, almost entirely an act of will. People stopped what they were doing, not in a welcoming way. A man outside the general store said something to another man, and they both looked. 2 women on the wooden sidewalk watched with the particular stillness of people deciding what category to put something in. A group of boys near the water trough stopped their argument and stared. Evelyn looked straight ahead. She had done her research, as much research as was possible when you were a widow with 5 children and $17 left to your name. Before leaving Millbrook, she had asked questions of anyone who'd passed through the territory. She knew that Redstone Crossing was a cattle town, growing fast, rough around the edges, but not lawless. She knew that the largest employer in the region was the Callahan Ranch, some 4 miles east of town, 20,000 acres, a significant operation, the kind of place that supported a dozen smaller businesses just by existing. She also knew, because people talked freely when they thought you weren't the sort to do anything with information, that the Callahan Ranch had recently lost its cook and most of its kitchen staff to a competing spread that had offered better wages, and that the cattle baron himself, a man named Wade Callahan, somewhere in his mid-40s, was reportedly in a foul mood about it. Evelyn had spent 2 days of the road journey turning this information over in her mind, examining it the way she'd have examined a piece of fabric before buying, looking for flaws, testing the weight of it, imagining what she could make with it. She drove the wagon to the far end of the main street, to a livery where she paid for one night's boarding of the horse, which left her with $14 and some change. Then she found a woman at the edge of town, a Mrs. Pruitt, who rented out a room in her house to travelers, and paid for one night's lodging for herself and the children. The room was small and smelled like old wood and something that had been washed but not quite gotten clean. May declared it smelled like a wet dog. Ruth told her to be quiet. Thomas sat on the floor with his back against the wall and closed his eyes. Clara's cough was worse. Evelyn sat on the edge of the narrow bed and did the arithmetic in her head. $14. 6 people. 1 horse. 1 wagon. No position, no connections, no husband's name to trade on, nothing but what she knew how to do. She knew how to cook. More than that, she understood food the way some people understood music or land or numbers. She understood how to feed a large group of people efficiently, how to make cheap ingredients into something that made people feel taken care of, how to manage a kitchen like a small military operation. She had cooked for Harlan's farmhands for 11 years. She had cooked for church socials and harvest gatherings, and once, memorably, for a county official's dinner when the hired woman took sick and someone needed to step in at 3 hours' notice. She was not a woman who placed excessive stock in her own abilities, but this one thing, she knew. In the morning, she washed her face and her children's faces, put on the dress she'd been saving for situations that required a better impression than the road had left on her, and drove the wagon 4 miles east to the Callahan Ranch. The gate was iron, which was unusual for the territory, and was clearly meant to communicate something. The house beyond it was large and well built, not showy, but solid in a way that said the money here was old enough to have settled into confidence. There were outbuildings, corrals, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a structure that appeared to be a new barn still under construction. Everything was dusty and functional and organized with the particular efficiency of an operation that knew what it was doing. A ranch hand at the gate looked at her wagon and her children with the expression of a man who hadn't been expecting this particular situation and wasn't sure what his authority covered. "I'm here to see Wade Callahan," Evelyn said. "Mr. Callahan's not—" "Please tell him Evelyn Harper is at the gate and would like to speak with him about the kitchen position. I'll wait." The ranch hand opened his mouth, reconsidered, and went. She sat on the wagon seat and waited. Thomas sat beside her, quiet. The younger children were in the back. Clara coughed. Henry was already watching the ranch with the focused attention of a boy, cataloging everything for later use. "That's a lot of cows," Henry said. "Cattle," Thomas corrected. "That's a lot of cattle." "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." She had been waiting perhaps 15 minutes when the man came out of the house. She recognized the type before he got close enough to make out his face clearly. The walk, the set of the shoulders, the particular way powerful men in this territory moved through space as if they owned the ground under their feet, because often they did. He was wearing a work shirt and boots and no hat, which meant she'd interrupted him mid-task, which probably meant he was not in the ideal mood to be interrupted. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at her. He was somewhere around 45, a face that had spent years in weather, not a soft face. He looked at her, then at the children, then back at her. Something crossed his expression that might have been confusion, or it might have been the beginning of annoyance. "Mrs. Harper," he said. His voice was flat in the way that could mean a lot of things. "Mr. Callahan." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting to be helped. Not as a statement. She was just practical about time. "I understand your kitchen staff left you short. I'd like to be considered for the head cook position." A pause. "My kitchen staff," he said. "Yes. Where'd you hear about that?" "People talk in Millbrook, and presumably in town." She didn't elaborate. The source didn't matter. Wade Callahan looked at her in a way that suggested he was running calculations. He glanced again at the children. "You've got 5 children." "I do." "You'd be bringing them onto the ranch." "They're well behaved and they can all contribute in some capacity. Thomas is 14 and strong. Ruth and Clara can help with lighter work. Henry and May won't be in anyone's way." "That's a significant presumption on your part, Mrs. Harper." "I'm not presuming. I'm telling you what I'm offering and letting you decide." She kept her voice level. "I won't ask for charity. I'm asking for a fair wage in exchange for work that I'm capable of doing well. If you want to know what I can do, give me access to your kitchen for one meal, tonight's supper. If it's not better than what you've been eating since your staff left, I'll be gone in the morning." The silence stretched. Somewhere behind her, May sneezed. Thomas said "bless you" automatically, which was either charming or terrible timing, and possibly both. Wade Callahan was looking at her with an expression that had shifted from flat to something more complicated. Not warmth, more like recalibration. "How long were you on the road?" he asked. 9 days? Where from?" "Millbrook." "That's a hard road." "Yes." "Your youngest looks sick. She has a cough." "It's not serious." She said it without blinking, which was perhaps a slight overstatement of her confidence. But she needed him to see competence, not worry. Wade Callahan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wagon, at the horse, at the sky above the property, as if consulting it for some opinion, and then back at her. "You can use the kitchen," he said. "Tonight. We'll see about the rest." "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, the way you'd thank a hardware store owner for holding a door, not like it was a gift she was receiving. He turned to go, then, without turning back, "The kitchen's a mess. My last cook left it in poor condition." "I've worked in worse," she said. He didn't answer that. He went back into the house. The ranch hand at the gate was still standing there, looking like a man who'd witnessed something he couldn't quite categorize. Evelyn turned to her children. "We're going to work," she said. The kitchen was, in fact, a disaster. It had been clearly abandoned in some haste, pots left unscraped, dry goods left open to pests, a cutting surface that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks by the smell of it. There was a larder that was stocked but chaotic, a woodpile that was adequate, and a stove that was well made and would be a pleasure to work with once she had it cleaned and calibrated. She stood in the doorway and assessed it for 30 seconds. Then she put May and Henry in the corner of the room with specific instructions to stay seated and not touch anything, gave Clara a rag, and set her to wiping down the far counter while Thomas began hauling out the pots that needed washing, assigned Ruth to the larder inventory, and got to work. She found, within the first hour, that the ranch had acceptable stores. There was a good quantity of dried beans and cornmeal and salt pork, a half barrel of flour that was still good, onions, some dried peppers, a cured ham that had another week of life in it, and a supply of dried corn that could be cracked. There were eggs. Someone was keeping the chickens, at least. She could work with this. One of the ranch hands knocked on the kitchen door around 3 in the afternoon, ostensibly to ask if she needed anything, but actually, she understood, to look. He was a man in his 30s, weathered, with an honest face and the cautious manner of someone who'd learned not to make assumptions too quickly. "Name's Bert," he said. "Bert Dawson. I keep things running when Mr. Callahan's busy." Evelyn Harper. She didn't look up from the beans she was sorting. "How many men am I feeding tonight?" 11 at the bunkhouse, plus Mr. Callahan makes 12. "Any food restrictions or conditions I should know about?" Bert Dawson blinked. That wasn't a question he'd been asked by a cook before. "Cy Amos is missing his back teeth on the left side. Can't chew tough things well." "All right." He hesitated. "You need any help?" "Thomas can carry things. I'll let you know if I need anything else." She paused. "The woodpile is low. I'll need it stocked before 6. Bert Dawson looked at her for a second, then nodded and left. 20 minutes later, she heard wood being stacked outside. Ruth came to her elbow. "Mama, there's mice in the larder." "I know. I saw the signs. We'll deal with it after tonight." "There are droppings on the flour sack." "The flour I'm using is from the bottom of the barrel, which was sealed. The top layer I set aside. It won't go in the food." Ruth looked at her. Ruth had her father's eyes and, increasingly, her father's habit of watching Evelyn with a kind of careful attention, as if taking notes. "Do you think he'll keep us?" Ruth asked. Evelyn didn't pause. "I think tonight's supper will be good. That's what I'm thinking about right now." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters right now." She handed Ruth a bowl. "Go crack those eggs." By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled different. That was always the first sign in Evelyn's experience. The smell of a kitchen told you whether someone knew what they were doing. The beans had been cooking for 3 hours, low and slow, with the ham bone and the dried peppers and a careful hand with the salt. The cornbread was resting. There was a pot of gravy that had started as pan drippings and onions and had become something considerably more than that. She'd found a small supply of dried apple that she'd stewed with sugar and cinnamon into something that would pass for a dessert. It was not an elaborate meal. It was a good one. At 6 o'clock, she sent Thomas to the bunkhouse to tell the men that supper was ready. She kept her children in the kitchen, May asleep in the corner on a folded blanket, Henry barely keeping his eyes open, Clara's cough quieter now. She stood at the stove and listened to the sounds of men moving toward the main house. Wade Callahan came into the kitchen at 6:10. He came in the back, through the kitchen, not the front, which suggested that was his habit, or that he wanted to look at what had been done. He stood in the doorway and looked at the stove, the cleared counters, the organized larder, the children arranged in the corner. "Smells different in here," he said. "It'll smell better tomorrow," Evelyn said. Tonight was a start. He stood there a moment longer, then went to eat with his men. She served herself and the children from what was left after the men had gone through. May woke up enough to eat half a bowl of beans before falling asleep again. Henry ate his full portion and looked around for more. Clara ate slowly, but she ate. Ruth sat straight at the rough kitchen table and said nothing. Thomas ate with the focused efficiency of someone who was very hungry and was trying not to look like it. Bert Dawson came back to the kitchen at 7:30. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was the frontier equivalent of high praise. "That was the best meal I've had on this ranch in 2 years," he said. "2 years suggests a previous standard I should ask about," Evelyn said, starting on the washing up. Bert Dawson laughed. It was the unpracticed laugh of a man who hadn't expected to laugh. "Fair point," he said. "You need anything?" "2 buckets of hot water, and if there's a cat anywhere on the property, I'd like to borrow it for the larder situation." "We've got 3 cats. I'll send one over." "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." "Bert," he said. "Everyone calls me Bert." Wade Callahan came back to the kitchen at 8 o'clock. The children were mostly asleep in the corner. Evelyn was finishing the last of the washing up. He came in, looked around, looked at the children, and sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which told her he was comfortable in this room in a way he hadn't been earlier. The food had done something, or the cleanliness had, or something had. "You can stay," he said. "Month trial. $20 a month, room for you and the children in the house. There's a back section that's been used for storage. I'll have it cleared. 3 meals a day for the men, plus whatever the household needs." Evelyn set down the rag she'd been using. She turned to face him. 25, she said. He looked at her. The usual rate for a ranch cook is... The usual cook doesn't manage a larder, train staff, or perform an inventory overhaul in the same afternoon they arrive. 25. Another one of those silences. He had a particular quality in his silences. They didn't feel like hesitation. They felt like thinking, which was not the same thing. 22, he said. Done, she said, because 22 was fair and pressing further would be a different kind of conversation. He stood up. He looked at the sleeping children with an expression that wasn't sentiment exactly, more like acknowledgement. "The cough," he said. "Your daughter." "She's had it for 4 days. It's improving. There's a doctor in town, Henley. He's decent. I'll take her to see him when I have the wages to do it." Wade Callahan reached into his shirt pocket and set some coins on the kitchen table. "Not a lot. Enough for a doctor's visit, probably." "Consider it an advance," he said, and he left before she could respond to it one way or another. She stood in the kitchen looking at the coins. She was not a sentimental person. She had learned in the years since Harlan's death to be careful about letting anything that looked like kindness open doors inside her that she'd worked to close. Kindness came with obligations and sometimes with costs that didn't get named until later. But she was also tired. 14 days of road and grief and relentless forward momentum, and she was tired in a way that was hard to locate in any specific part of her body. It was deeper than that, more structural. She picked up the coins and put them in her apron pocket. She went and sat in the corner near her sleeping children, and she did not cry. But she sat there for a long time in the quiet kitchen that smelled now of beans and wood smoke and clean surfaces, and she let herself be still for a few minutes, which was the closest she could come to rest. Thomas opened one eye. "Are we staying?" he asked. "For now," she said. He closed his eye. "Good," he said. "Those beans were good." "Go to sleep, Thomas." Yes, ma'am. Go on. The first person in town to form a strong opinion about Evelyn Harper was a woman named Harriet Crow, who ran the Redstone Crossing Ladies Civic Society, which was the primary social mechanism by which the town's elite managed information about everyone else. Harriet heard about the widow with 5 children who'd shown up at Callahan's gate 3 days after Evelyn arrived from a man who'd heard it from a ranch hand who'd been at the general store. Harriet Crow told 2 friends. Those friends told others. By the end of the first week, the version of events that was circulating in the town's drawing rooms had evolved considerably from the truth. In the most charitable version, Evelyn Harper was a desperate widow who'd arrived at Wade Callahan's ranch and leveraged her situation to gain employment, which was technically accurate if you stripped out any credit for her skill or work. In the less charitable version, which was more popular, she was a calculating woman who'd identified a wealthy unmarried man and positioned herself strategically. The least charitable version shouldn't be repeated. Evelyn knew about the talk. You couldn't exist in a town the size of Redstone Crossing without knowing what people were saying. It was the kind of place where news traveled faster than the people carrying it. She knew because when she went to the general store on her day off to buy cloth for mending, the proprietor's wife spoke to her with a careful pleasantness that was a very different thing from genuine friendliness. She knew because a woman she didn't know crossed to the other side of the street when she walked past. She knew because one of the younger ranch hands mentioned, in the indirect way young men had of trying to be helpful without admitting they were doing it, that some folks in town were saying things about her situation. What kind of things? She asked. He got red in the face. Nothing worth repeating. Tell me anyway, he told her. She went back to the kitchen and began the preparations for the noon meal. Her movements were the same. Her expression, Ruth noted from the doorway, was the expression their mother wore when she was thinking very hard about something and didn't want anyone to know it. What happened? Ruth asked. Nothing I didn't expect, Evelyn said. That's not the same as nothing. Evelyn looked at her daughter, 12 years old, and already had that precise quality of attention that could be either a gift or a source of suffering, depending on how the world treated it. People in town are making up stories about why I'm here, Evelyn said, because they don't know what to do with the real reason. What's the real reason? Because I needed work and I knew I could do it, and I walked up and asked for it. She handed Ruth a knife. That's all. Then why does it bother them? Evelyn considered the question seriously. Because it doesn't fit any of the stories they know, she said finally. A woman alone with children who doesn't ask for charity and doesn't apologize for needing things. They don't have a box to put that in. So they make up a story that fits their boxes instead. Ruth thought about this. That seems like their problem, she said. It does, Evelyn agreed, until they decide to make it mine. Oh, the other significant observer of Evelyn Harper's arrival was Victor Langford. Langford ran the Redstone Crossing Trading Company, which meant he ran about 40% of the commercial activity in the valley. He was 53, well-dressed by frontier standards, with silver at his temples, and the kind of smooth, considered manner that men developed when they'd spent decades practicing the difference between saying what they meant and saying what they needed people to hear. He had been trying to purchase a section of Callahan's land, specifically the eastern grazing section along the creek, for 2 years. Wade Callahan had not been interested. The relationship between the two men was civil in the way that relationships between people who fundamentally distrust each other are sometimes civil, polite, careful, and always slightly taut. Langford heard about the widow's arrival at the Callahan ranch within 48 hours of it happening. He asked several questions. He was given answers that were, by then, already partially transformed by the town's interpretive machinery. He sat with the information for a few days. He was not a man who moved quickly. He was a man who waited for situations to develop into something he could use. He was at the general store on a Thursday afternoon, the same afternoon Evelyn had come in to buy cloth, and he watched her interact with the proprietor and his wife. He watched her select her cloth with practical efficiency, conduct the transaction with a kind of quiet directness that was slightly unusual, and manage the proprietor's wife's careful pleasantness with a politeness that neither engaged with the subtext nor retreated from it. He watched her load her purchases into the wagon and drive back toward the Callahan Road. He said nothing at the time. He filed the observation away with the other observations. A week later, Wade Callahan came into town for a meeting at the bank, and Langford happened to be on the street when he came out. Heard you've got a new cook, Langford said, with the mild interest of a man making conversation. I do, Wade said, in the flat tone of a man not interested in having a conversation. Woman from Millbrook, 5 children. That's right. Quite a situation. Langford's voice was pleasantly neutral. Doing well, is she? Doing her job, Wade said. And that was all he said, and he walked on. Langford watched him go. He was beginning to have a clear idea of how this situation might develop, and what he could do with it when the time was right. What Langford hadn't calculated, what most people in Redstone Crossing hadn't calculated, was what Evelyn would do in the time between her arrival and whatever confrontation was coming. She built something. It happened the way things happened when you were good at your work and didn't have time for anything else. Quietly, incrementally, through 1,000 small decisions that accumulated. She reorganized the kitchen not just in terms of cleanliness, but in terms of efficiency, developing a system that meant meals were ready on time every time. That waste was minimized, that the men who worked 16-hour days in the dust and heat came to the table and found something that made the day slightly more bearable. She learned names, all 11 ranch hands, their preferences, their complaints about their backs and their teeth, who ate too fast and who ate too slow, who was grateful and said so, and who was grateful and didn't know how. She didn't make a production of this knowledge. She just used it, quietly, in the details. She involved her children. Thomas worked alongside the ranch hands on lighter tasks, and was by the 3rd week accepted among them in the provisional, gruff way that frontier men accepted young men who worked hard and didn't complain. Ruth helped in the kitchen with a seriousness that matched her mother's. Claire's cough cleared up after the doctor's visit, 2 days of rest and medicine, and she developed a particular friendship with an old hand named Pete, who had grandchildren somewhere in Kansas, and who spent an unusual amount of his free time teaching her to braid rope. Henry made friends with one of the cats. May, once she recovered from the long journey, was simply herself everywhere at once, narrating the ranch's daily operations to anyone who would listen and several people who wouldn't. The men noticed. It was the kind of thing that was hard to articulate directly, so they didn't. They just stayed a little longer over meals, said good morning more often, laughed more in the evenings. Bert Dawson, who'd been running on grim efficiency for months, seemed to remember that he was a person with a particular sense of humor and not just a function. Wade Callahan noticed something different. He was a private man, the kind of private that came from years of being the person everyone else needed something from and having no one to need anything from in return. He'd run the ranch since his father's death 20 years ago, and he'd done it with relentless competence and very little warmth, and he'd accepted this as the nature of the work. What he noticed in the weeks after Evelyn's arrival was something he couldn't immediately name. The ranch had always been functional. It was becoming, in some way he found difficult to articulate, a place he was slightly less reluctant to come in from the fields to. He wasn't a man who analyzed his own reactions at length. He identified this change, turned it over once, and set it aside. He had enough to do. They talked in the evenings, not often, and not deeply, but occasionally, in the kitchen after the children were asleep and the dinner things were cleared, with the specific quality of 2 tired people who were both, without quite acknowledging it, grateful for a few minutes of adult conversation with someone whose judgment they'd begun, cautiously, to respect. She told him about Harlan once, just a few sentences, practical ones about what kind of man he'd been and how the farm had worked. He listened without comment. He told her once about the first year he'd run the ranch after his father, how badly he'd managed it and how slowly he'd learned. She listened without comment. That was about as far as it went. Neither of them was in a position to go further, and both understood this, and it didn't need to be said. What neither of them understood yet was that, outside the ranch gates, the story being told about them was becoming something much more complicated than the truth, and that a certain man with silver at his temples and something to gain was watching it very carefully. The trouble was building. They just didn't know it yet. The trouble didn't announce itself. It rarely did. It started as most trouble in small towns starts, with a conversation that wasn't meant to be overheard. Evelyn was at the general store on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into her time at the Callahan Ranch, picking up a supply order she'd arranged with the proprietor, a man named Gus Fielding, who had gradually shifted from carefully neutral to something approaching genuine helpfulness. Once he understood she was a consistent, reliable customer with specific needs and no patience for being shorted on quality. She was waiting for Gus to finish tallying the order when she heard her name from the back corner of the store, where two women were looking at bolts of fabric and apparently believed themselves to be speaking quietly. They were not speaking quietly enough. Told me straight from Harriet, that woman has made herself completely indispensable over there. Which is exactly the point, isn't it? 5 children and no prospects. Of course she's going to. Well, and what does that say about him is what I want to know. A man his age letting some stranger move her entire family into, she's not in the main house, I heard. She's in the back. For now. A pause. Then a sound that was not quite a laugh. Evelyn did not turn around. She watched Gus's pencil move down the column of figures. Her hands were still on the counter. She was aware of a specific quality of stillness in her own body. The kind that came from keeping something in that needed a place to go. Gus looked up, and something in her face made him glance briefly toward the back corner and then back at her. He cleared his throat. "That's $14.50 for the lot," he said, a little louder than necessary. "Thank you, Gus," she said, and paid him, and carried the first box out to the wagon herself before he could offer to help. She drove back to the ranch with her jaw set and her eyes on the road and let herself be angry for the length of the journey, which was 4 miles, which was not enough but was what she had. By the time she turned through the gate, she'd put it somewhere she could function around it. Not away. She'd stopped pretending she could put things away years ago. Just somewhere she wasn't standing on top of it. Thomas met her at the wagon to help unload. He looked at her face and said nothing, which was one of the things she appreciated most about him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that the conversation in the back corner of Fielding's store was not the origin of anything. It was a symptom. The origin was Victor Langford, who had spent 3 weeks quietly doing what he did best, which was talk to people. Not loudly, not in ways that could be traced back to him directly, just mentioning things, asking small questions that planted larger ones, expressing mild concern in the measured tones of a civic-minded man about the welfare of the Callahan Ranch's reputation, and more pointedly, about the welfare of 5 children being raised in what he carefully described as an irregular domestic situation. He was not yet attacking. He was preparing the ground. The first person to carry his words to Evelyn's awareness was, unexpectedly, Bert Dawson. Bert was not a man who got involved in things that weren't his business, as a general principle. He'd lived 40 years on the frontier by keeping his head down and doing his work and letting other people's drama pass him by like weather. But he had a particular dislike for unfairness, the specific, quiet dislike of someone who'd been on the receiving end of it and remembered what it felt like. And what he was hearing in town troubled him enough to override his instinct toward non-involvement. He came to the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon when Evelyn was doing the weekly accounting of the stores. He sat down at the kitchen table without preamble, turned his hat in his hands twice, and said, "There's talk in town I think you ought to know about." Evelyn set down her pencil. "Tell me," he told her. Not everything. He edited for what he judged she needed to know versus what would just cause pain without purpose. But enough. Langford's name. The nature of the concern being expressed. The word petition being used in at least one conversation in reference to the children. Evelyn sat with this information for a moment. "A petition for what?" she asked, though she already had a reasonable idea. "For the county to review the children's situation, whether they're being properly provided for." Bert's jaw tightened. "It's nonsense. Anyone with eyes can see those children are—" "It's not nonsense," Evelyn said quietly. "It's a strategy." She picked up her pencil again, set it down again. "Do you know what Langford wants from this ranch?" Bert's expression shifted. "The east section, along the creek. And Wade won't sell. Hasn't wanted to for 2 years." She was quiet for a moment. "So making trouble for the ranch, for Wade specifically, is useful to him regardless of whether the trouble sticks." Bert looked at her. "You figured that out fast. I've met men like Langford before. Not this one, but the type." She stood up and went back to the supplies shelf, running her finger down the inventory list. "Thank you for telling me, Bert. What are you going to do?" "My job," she said. "For now, that's what I'm going to do." Bert hesitated. He wanted, she could tell, to say something else, something reassuring or perhaps cautionary, or perhaps just present. He was not a man who was good at any of those things. He put his hat back on. For what it's worth, he said, the men here, all of us, we see what you're doing, what you've built here in 3 weeks. He stopped. It matters. Thank you, she said again, and this time she meant it a different way, and he understood the difference. He left. She stood at the shelf and did not move for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then she went back to the accounting. She did not tell the children. Thomas, she suspected, would hear something. He spent enough time around the ranch hands to pick up the currents, but she didn't say anything directly. What she could control, she controlled. She kept the kitchen running with the same precision. She kept the household organized. She kept her children visible in their ordinary competence. Ruth helping with the mending, Henry working alongside Thomas, Clara spending her afternoons with Pete learning useful things, May being May in full view of anyone who cared to observe. If someone was going to argue that her children were not being properly raised, she would make that argument as difficult as possible to sustain. Wade Callahan heard about the talk 5 days later, from a different source, the banker he dealt with in town, who mentioned it in the careful way that bankers mention things they thought you should know without wanting to be seen as the source of the information. He came back to the ranch that afternoon in the particular mood Bert Dawson recognized as the one where something was working on him from the inside and hadn't yet decided what to do about itself. He came to the kitchen that evening after supper was cleared and the children were settling for the night. Evelyn was at the table with her inventory ledger. He sat down across from her, which was unusual enough that she set the ledger down and gave him her full attention. "You know about Langford," he said. Not a question. "Bert told me about a week ago." Something moved across his expression. Not anger at Bert, she thought, more like the recalibration of a man adjusting to the fact that people in his orbit had already been moving around a problem he'd only just learned about. "Why didn't you come to me?" "I didn't know yet what it was going to become. I was watching it." "It's becoming a problem," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I can talk to Langford directly. That might make it worse. If he's using this as pressure on a land deal, knowing it's working will encourage him." She paused. "What does he actually want? The east section? Is there something specific about it?" Wade looked at her with the expression he sometimes had when she said something that adjusted his angle on a situation. "The creek," he said. "There's a water rights question he's been trying to get resolved in his favor for 3 years. If he owns that section, it changes the calculation." "Then this isn't really about my children at all." "No, it isn't." "That's useful to know," she said. "It doesn't make the problem smaller." "No, but it means the solution is different than if it were actually about my children." She folded her hands on the table. "If I defend myself by defending my children, I'm fighting on his ground. But if the real issue is the land deal, that's your fight, not mine. And those are 2 separate things." Wade looked at her. "You separate things very cleanly." "I've had to learn to." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was thinking rather than agreeing. "I'll deal with the land issue. That's mine to handle." He paused. "But Langford's not the only problem. There are people in town who are ready to believe the worst because it's more interesting than the truth." "I know. That bothers you." She looked at him with a directness that wasn't challenge, just honesty. "Of course it bothers me. I have children, people making up stories about their mother's character. Yes, that bothers me." She picked up her pencil. "It just doesn't change what I do." Wade Callahan sat there for another moment. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at some middle distance, at the wall or beyond it. "I should have said this before," he said. "I should have made it clearer to people in town what the arrangement here is. What it is and what it isn't. I didn't, and that let the story fill in the blanks." It was, she thought, close to an apology, coming from a man who probably hadn't apologized for much in a long time, and wasn't entirely sure how. "It wouldn't have stopped Langford," she said. "No, but it might have stopped some of the rest. Maybe." She wrote a figure in the ledger. "It's done. We deal with what is." He stood up. He started to say something, stopped, started again. "If this gets worse, if it comes to something formal, I want you to know that this ranch stands behind you. That's not—" He paused. "That's not just me saying that because you work here." Evelyn looked up from the ledger. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. That means something. He nodded once and left. She sat in the quiet kitchen and looked at the open ledger and didn't write anything in it for a while. The thing about kindness, she'd thought about this before, would think about it again, was that it was hardest to receive when you'd been managing without it for so long that you'd stopped expecting it. When it arrived, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing up too fast after sitting on the ground for hours. Something in you had to readjust. She closed the ledger and went to check on her children. The formal attack came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of specific detail you remembered afterward, not because Tuesday had any particular significance, but because the ordinariness of it was its own kind of cruelty. Evelyn was at the general store when Harriet Crow came in with two other women from the Ladies' Civic Society, and the conversation that had been a murmur in back corners for 3 weeks arrived, suddenly, in the open. Harriet Crow was a woman in her late 40s with a wide face and the particular quality of righteousness that came from having never, in her own experience, needed to make difficult choices. She was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who'd decided, at some point, that the hierarchy of Redstone Crossing society was essentially correct, and that people who challenged it, who didn't fit its categories, who didn't ask for permission to exist within its structures, were implicitly a problem. She looked at Evelyn in the general store with the expression of a woman who'd been rehearsing something. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "I wonder if I might speak candidly with you." Evelyn set down the tin she'd been examining. "Go ahead." "There is genuine concern in this community about the situation you've placed your children in. A boarding house arrangement at a bachelor's ranch, with no proper female supervision or established social position." "I'm their mother," Evelyn said. "That's both female supervision and established social position." Harriet Crow's chin lifted slightly. "A woman working as a servant in a household is not the same as a cook is not a servant. The distinction may be finer than you imagine. The point is that respectable families in this community have begun to ask questions about whether those children's welfare is truly being served, and whether—" "Mrs. Crow." Evelyn's voice was still level. Something in it made the woman stop. "I understand what you're saying. I understand who is behind the questions being asked. I want you to understand something in return." She took a half step forward. Not aggressive, just close enough to make this conversation unambiguously direct. "My children are fed, clothed, educated, housed, and loved. They work. Because work has dignity, and because I'm raising them to know that. Anyone who wants to examine that situation is welcome to do so. But I won't be performed at. If you have a legitimate concern, bring it to me plainly. If you're here to deliver a message on someone else's behalf, I'd suggest you think carefully about whether that's a service worth performing." The silence in the store was the specific silence of a room full of people pretending not to have heard something. Harriet Crow's expression went through several stages in quick succession. She settled on a kind of stiffened dignity. "I see," she said. "Good." Evelyn picked up the tin again. "Gus, I'll take 2 of these and whatever came in on the Thursday order." Harriet Crow left with her companions. Gus Fielding, behind the counter, was doing an admirable job of looking at his inventory records with exceptional focus. "That woman has been in here 4 times this week," he said, without looking up. "I imagine she has," Evelyn said. "Victor Langford was in here Monday." Evelyn looked at him. Gus shrugged, just noting it. He still wasn't looking at her. "For what it's worth, my wife said, she said to tell you the cornbread recipe you gave her worked out. She's made it twice." Evelyn thought of Gus's wife coming to the ranch door 2 weeks ago to introduce herself. The slightly awkward exchange of a woman who wasn't sure she approved of Evelyn but was curious about her, the conversation about cooking that had loosened something between them. "Tell her I'm glad," Evelyn said. Small things. It was always small things that built anything real. The recipe passed along, the name remembered, the help offered at the right moment. Langford was moving large pieces. But large pieces move slowly. Small things accumulated faster than anyone expected. She was learning who was watching, in this town, and what they were seeing. The ranch hands had opinions. 11 men, most of them long in the territory, some of them with families in town or families they'd lost or families they'd left behind for reasons that were nobody else's business. They'd watched Evelyn work for a month now. They'd eaten her food and watched her manage her children and watched her handle difficulty without falling apart, and watched her treat them like people whose names and circumstances mattered. Men like that don't talk much, but they notice everything. Old Pete, who had the most seniority on the ranch and the respect that came with it, said something to Bert Dawson one evening that Bert passed on to Evelyn later because he thought she should hear it. Pete had said, "That woman has more backbone than any man I've worked beside in 30 years. Anyone tries to take those kids, they'll have to come through all of us first." Evelyn heard this and folded it up carefully and kept it somewhere it wouldn't get lost. Victor Langford's next move came at the end of the 4th week, and it was not subtle. He filed a formal inquiry with the county clerk's office, a petition requesting a review of the welfare of 5 minor children residing at the Callahan Ranch, signed by Langford himself and by 4 other prominent citizens, including, Evelyn noted with a particular kind of tiredness, Harriet Crow. The petition was careful. It didn't accuse. It expressed concern. It used the word irregular 3 times and the phrase best interests of the children 5 times. It requested that a hearing be scheduled at which the court could assess the children's situation and determine whether any corrective intervention was warranted. Evelyn read a copy of it, obtained through a connection Bert Dawson had at the clerk's office, sitting at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, with the children asleep and the ranch quiet. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. It was one thing to know trouble was coming. It was another thing to see it on paper, in official language, with 5 signatures, aimed at her children. May was 4. Henry was 8. Clara, who'd just gotten over her cough and had started learning to braid rope from Pete and had laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. Ruth, who was closing off somewhere inside and needed time and stability to open again. Thomas, who was shouldering things no 14-year-old should shoulder and doing it without complaint. Her children. She became aware sitting there of a particular quality of anger, not the hot kind that made you loud and careless, but the cold kind that went very deep and very still, and was, in some ways, the more dangerous type, the kind that didn't burn itself out. She pulled the petition toward her and read it a 3rd time, and this time she was reading it differently, not as a woman receiving a blow, but as a woman identifying the specific weaknesses in an argument. There were several. She picked up her pencil. By the time she went to bed, she'd filled 2 pages of her own notes. She lay in the dark listening to her children breathe, all 5 of them in the back section of the house that had been cleared for them, their sounds familiar and particular as her own heartbeat. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about what she was going to do. She was not going to run. That had never been a real option, and she knew it. Running would confirm the story they'd written about her. It would uproot her children again from a place that was, slowly, imperfectly, day by day, becoming something that resembled stability. It would mean surrendering to a man who'd manufactured a problem for his own profit and was now asking her to solve it by disappearing. She was not going to run. She was going to stand in a courtroom, and she was going to make them look at the truth. But first she was going to spend the next several weeks building the most airtight case anyone in Redstone Crossing had ever seen for why those 5 children were exactly where they belonged, with their mother in a home she had built with her own hands and her own work and nothing else. She had done harder things than this. She thought of the wagon wheel outside Millbrook, the 2 nights by the road, the iron bar Harlan had planned to use for a fence he never finished. She had done harder things than this. Sleep, when it finally came, was not peaceful, but it was sleep. And in the morning, there was work to do. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which gave Evelyn time she intended to use down to the last hour. She started with what she knew. She knew the petition rested on the word irregular, a word that meant nothing legally, but meant everything socially, in a town where appearances carried the weight of law. She knew the signatories were influential, but not numerous, which meant the middle ground of the town. The people who hadn't signed and hadn't spoken against her either was still available to be reached. And she knew that Victor Langford's real target was Wade's land, which meant the petition was a pressure tactic, not a sincere welfare concern, and that distinction, if she could demonstrate it clearly enough, would matter to a judge. She wrote letters, not to officials, not yet, but to the families she'd quietly helped in the weeks since her arrival. The Mercer family, whose youngest had been sick and whose mother had come to the ranch door pale with worry, Evelyn had sent medicine and a pot of soup, and Thomas to sit with the older children for an afternoon. The Dolan family, who farmed 6 miles south and whose wife had come to ask, cautiously, about Evelyn's bread recipe, and stayed 2 hours and left with the recipe and 3 jars of preserved apple. The Garrity widow, who was 70 and largely forgotten by the town's civic structure and who had received, without asking, a weekly food parcel from the ranch kitchen for the past 3 weeks. Evelyn's own arrangement, taken from the surplus she'd identified in the ranch's stores and quietly redirected. These people had not signed Langford's petition. They had watched. They were watching still. She wrote to each of them plainly, not asking for anything specific, just telling them what had been filed and why she thought it had been filed, and letting them draw their own conclusions. She did not perform distress. She did not ask for pity. She simply gave them the information and said that if anyone wished to speak on her children's behalf, she would be grateful. The responses came back over the following week. Not all of them. Some people were too cautious or too dependent on Langford's commercial network to risk it. But enough. The Mercer husband sent a note that said he and his wife would be at the hearing. The Dolan wife came to the ranch in person, which told Evelyn more than a letter could. "I want you to know," the Dolan wife said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, "that my husband and I have had some business dealings with Victor Langford, and I want you to know that we know what kind of man he is." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "He told my husband 2 years ago that he'd make things difficult for us if we didn't sell him the water access on our east pasture. We didn't sell." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "He made things difficult for a while, and then he moved on to the next thing." She looked at Evelyn directly. "He moves on when it stops working. We'll testify." It was the kind of conversation that could have been a turning point. Evelyn didn't let herself think of it as one. Experience had taught her that turning points usually looked like something else until after they'd already happened. But she thanked the woman sincerely and wrote her name in the ledger she'd started keeping, where the column for potential witnesses was growing slowly but steadily. Bert Dawson, meanwhile, had taken on the task of talking to the ranch hands, not instructing them, just opening the conversation, letting them know what was happening and leaving the decision to each man. All 11 of them, individually and without coordination, said the same thing in different words. They'd speak if asked. Pete said it in the fewest words. 11 men saying that woman runs a decent household beats 5 names on a piece of paper, he told Bert. And that's all a judge needs to hear. Evelyn kept cooking. She kept the kitchen running with the same precision, kept the household organized, kept her children in the visible middle of an ordinary, functional life. She did not let herself unravel in front of them, which required a sustained effort she was aware of as a physical thing, like holding a door closed against wind. Ruth knew something was wrong. Ruth always knew. She came to Evelyn on a Sunday afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a girl who'd been old enough, when her father died, to understand what adult faces looked like when they were managing something serious. "Tell me," Ruth said. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down and told her. Not everything, but enough. The petition, the hearing, what Langford wanted, and why. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was more than most adults could manage. When Evelyn finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can they actually take us?" "They can try." Evelyn kept her voice even. "I'm not going to let that happen." "How?" "By making the truth louder than the lies." She reached across the table and put her hand over Ruth's briefly. "I need you to keep being who you are, that's all. Just be exactly who you are where people can see it." Ruth thought about this. "May's going to be a problem," she said. "She talks constantly." "May will be fine. May talks constantly about true things. That's useful." Something shifted in Ruth's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the loosening that came before. "What about Thomas?" "Thomas knows. I'll talk to him tonight." Ruth nodded. She started to get up, then stopped. "Mama," she paused. "Papa would have been furious." "Yes," Evelyn said. "He would have been very loud and very furious and probably not very helpful, and then he would have gone and done something decisive that turned out to be exactly right." Her voice stayed steady. "I'm working on the decisive part." Ruth smiled then. A real one. Small, but real. She got up and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes after that, looking at nothing, letting herself have those few minutes. The storm came on a Thursday, 18 days before the hearing, with no particular warning. It started as the kind of sky that experienced frontier people looked at and filed away. A specific quality of stillness in the air, a color on the western horizon that wasn't quite normal. By mid-afternoon, it had become something more significant, and by 4 o'clock, Bert Dawson had sent 2 of the younger hands to bring in the horses and was eyeing the new barn's construction with visible concern. "That west wall isn't fully secured," Wade said, coming out of the house and reading the sky the way a man reads something he's read before and doesn't like. "If the wind comes from the northwest—" "I know," Bert said. "Cy and Marcus should reinforce the bracing." "Already sent them." They stood together for a moment in the particular shorthand of 2 men who'd worked the same land through a lot of different weather and didn't need to say much to each other. Evelyn had been watching from the kitchen window. She went to the back section and found the children. "Thomas, I need you out front helping with whatever Bert needs. Ruth, you take May and Henry to the main room and stay there. Clara, you're with me." "What's happening?" Henry asked. "Storm, move." She went to the kitchen and began securing things. Anything that could become a projectile in the kind of wind that sometimes followed this kind of sky. She sent Clara to fill every available container with water, because you always filled water before a serious storm, because serious storms had a way of fouling wells and breaking pipes, and because a kitchen that ran out of water during a crisis was a kitchen that stopped being useful. The storm hit at 5:30. It was not the worst storm the territory had seen, but it was serious enough. The wind came from the northwest, as Wade had predicted, and it hit the new barn's west wall with a force that Cy and Marcus had not quite finished bracing against. Evelyn heard the sound from inside the house. A crack followed by a deep groan that was the sound of structural timber making decisions under pressure. Then she heard shouting. She went to the kitchen door and opened it against the wind, which took real effort. In the yard, through the rain and the horizontal dust, she could make out movement near the barn. Men's voices, a sound that might have been an animal in distress. She went back to the kitchen, grabbed the lantern she'd lit when the sky started darkening, and went out. The scene at the barn was the specific kind of chaos that had its own internal logic once you understood it. The west wall had partially given way, and 2 of the interior support beams had shifted. 3 horses were in the damaged section, spooked, moving wrong, dangerous in their panic. Cy had a cut on his forehead that was bleeding freely. Marcus was trying to hold a beam in place with his body weight and losing the argument. Wade was in the middle of it, doing 3 things at once, with the focused economy of a man who'd been in bad situations before and knew that efficiency was the only available luxury. Evelyn assessed all of this in about 4 seconds. "Cy." She grabbed his arm as she passed. "Sit down. Hold this over that cut." She pressed his own hand against his forehead with a rag she'd brought from the kitchen. "Don't move." "The horses? I'll get the horses." "Sit." She went into the damaged section of the barn. She'd grown up on a farm. She knew horses. She knew frightened horses specifically, which were a different problem from horses in general, because frightened horses had stopped being rational animals and had become 4-legged instinct. And instinct under pressure was most reliably redirected by stillness and by sound. She started talking. Not loudly, low, continuous. The kind of even murmur that was less about the words than about the tone, the persistence, the signal that something nearby was not panicking and therefore maybe the world wasn't ending. The nearest horse, a bay mare she'd fed by hand enough times that they had an understanding, turned its head toward her. "Come on," she said. "Come on now, let's go." She got the mare. Then the second horse, a gray gelding who was scared but not entirely unreasonable. The third was Wade's stallion, which was both the most valuable and the most frightened, and which was backed against the damaged wall in a way that was a hazard to itself and anyone near it. Wade appeared beside her. "He'll kick," Wade said. "I know." She handed him the mare's lead. "Take these 2. She looked at the stallion. "What does he respond to?" "He responds to me, mostly." "Then get over there and be his person," she said. "I'll come from the left. You come from the right and talk to him." Wade looked at her for a second. Not long, they didn't have long. And then he went to the right and started talking to the stallion in a low voice, and Evelyn went to the left with her lantern, and the horse's attention split between them, and the splitting of its attention was enough to interrupt the pure panic cycle. And 30 seconds later, Wade had the lead. They got all 3 horses out. They were in the rain and the wind, and it was ugly, but they got them out. The storm blew for another 2 hours. During those 2 hours, Evelyn ran the kitchen as a field operation. Hot water for Cy's head wound, which required 3 stitches she did herself because the doctor was in town, and the town was 4 miles away in a storm. Coffee and food for the men working to stabilize the barn. A dry space for the 2 younger hands who'd taken the worst of the wind and needed to sit down and get warm. An accounting of everything that had been damaged or needed immediate attention, which she compiled and handed to Bert while the storm was still running. Bert took the list and looked at it and looked at her. He was soaked through and his hat was somewhere in the northern pasture, probably. "How did you—" "I've run a farm through bad weather before," she said. "Go." He went. At some point during the second hour, Thomas appeared at her elbow in the kitchen, also wet, with the look of a boy who'd been doing real work and knew it. "The east fence section came down," he said. "Bert said to tell you." "All right." She handed him a bowl. "Eat something, then go back and help." "Yes, ma'am." He ate standing up, fast, and went. May and Henry had stayed in the main room as instructed. May, when Evelyn checked on them during a brief lull, was narrating the storm to Henry in real time with the focused commentary of a very small journalist. "It's still very loud," May reported. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "Is everyone okay?" "Cy has a cut on his head. He's going to be fine." "How many stitches?" 3. May considered this with great seriousness. "I want to see." "You can see tomorrow. Stay here." "The horses were scared," May said. "They were." "You went in there," May said. It was an observation, not a question, but there was something in it that Evelyn recognized as the beginning of a particular kind of understanding. The understanding that grew in children when they watched their parents do something genuinely hard. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I did." She smoothed May's hair. "Stay here." When the storm finally quit, sometime after 8 o'clock, the ranch looked like something that had been shaken in a very large hand. Debris across every open space. The west wall of the new barn was a write-off. 2 sections of fencing were down. 1 outbuilding had lost its roof. But the horses were in. The men were whole. Cy's head wound the worst injury, and it was a bad cut but not a dangerous one. The main house and the bunkhouse had held. The kitchen was intact, the fire was going, and there was food. The men came in from the storm dark in 1s and 2s, wet and dirty and tired, and they sat at the kitchen table and they ate, and the kitchen was warm, and Evelyn moved between the stove and the table and kept everything coming. Nobody said much. That was its own kind of thing, the quiet of people who'd been through something together and didn't need to discuss it yet. Wade came in last. He sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking for a long time. When the other men began to filter out to the bunkhouse, he stayed. When the kitchen was quiet and Evelyn was at the counter finishing the last of the cleanup, he said, without preamble, "That was well done tonight." She didn't stop what she was doing. It needed doing. "You stitched Cy's head. 3 stitches. He'll be fine." "You went into the barn for the horses." "The horses needed to come out." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people in a storm like that stay where they're put. Most people don't have a mare they've been feeding by hand for 6 weeks. She turned around and leaned against the counter. "And most people don't have 5 children they'd very much like to still be alive for." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the vicinity of one. "Fair enough," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was something in the kitchen that had been building in the margins of their evening conversations for weeks now, something that neither of them had named because naming it required a kind of vulnerability that both of them had learned was expensive. The storm had stripped something away, some layer of careful distance, and what was underneath it was something they both noticed and neither addressed. "I'll ask about the barn repairs in the morning," she said, which was practical and true, and also a way of stepping back from the moment without pretending the moment hadn't existed. "Good idea," he said, which was the same thing from his end. He got up and left. She turned back to the counter and finished cleaning up and stood in the quiet kitchen for a few minutes before going to check on her children. What neither of them had seen in the chaos of the storm was that they'd had a witness. Nora Dolan had been caught by the storm's early edge on her way home from visiting a neighbor and had taken shelter with her horse in the small outbuilding nearest the road, the one whose roof came off later, which meant she'd moved before that happened. She'd come to the kitchen door in the first hour of the storm, and Evelyn had let her in without thinking much about it, and Nora had sat in the corner and stayed out of the way with the quiet competence of a woman who knew when the best help was no help. She'd watched everything. She came to Evelyn 2 days after the storm, when the ranch was in the slow, heavy work of cleanup and assessment. She came to the kitchen door and sat down across from Evelyn at the table and folded her hands and said, "I want you to know what I saw that night." "You don't have to." "I want to." Nora's voice was quiet but firm. "I want to, because I'm going to say the same thing to the judge. I watched you run that kitchen like a command post. I watched you stitch a man's head because there was no one else to do it. I watched you go into a damaged barn in a storm for 3 horses, and I watched you manage 5 children and 11 men without once losing your head or raising your voice." She paused. "I've raised 4 children. I know what that takes, and I know what kind of woman it takes to do it." Evelyn sat across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you, Nora," she said finally. Her voice came out slightly uneven, which she hadn't planned, and she cleared her throat. Nora nodded. "Victor Langford has been very useful to a lot of people in this valley," she said, "which is why people are careful around him. But useful and right aren't the same thing, and most people know the difference when they bother to look." It was a careful statement. It said something without quite saying everything it knew. Evelyn understood there was more behind it, something Nora was weighing, but she didn't press. People came to the truth in their own time, and pressing rarely accelerated the process. 2 days later, Nora came back. This time she brought her husband, and this time she told Evelyn something she hadn't told her before. She told her about the letter. 6 months earlier, Victor Langford had written to the county seat, not to the court, but to a certain official in the land records office, suggesting that a review of water rights in the Redstone Crossing Valley was overdue, and that certain holdings, specifically the eastern section of the Callahan Ranch, were in ambiguous territory legally. The letter was careful. It was also, Nora said, witnessed by her husband without Langford's knowledge, during a visit to the county offices on unrelated business. The letter preceded the petition by 5 months. The land deal had come first. The concern for the children had come second. The sequence mattered. In a courtroom, the sequence was everything. Evelyn sat with this information and felt the cold anger from the night she'd first read the petition shift into something more focused. Something that had edges now, and weight, and a specific direction. She went to find Wade. She found him at the east fence line, working with Marcus on the sections that had come down in the storm. She walked out to him across the field with the information in her head, organized the way she organized a supply list. Specific, ordered, everything accounted for. She told him about the letter. He listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Dolan saw it," he said. "Yes." He'd testify to that. He said he would. Wade was quiet again. Then, "Langford had this planned from the beginning." "Before the beginning," she said. "Before I arrived. The land piece was already in motion. My situation just gave him a faster lever." Wade looked at the fence post he'd been working on, then out at the field, then at her. Something in his expression was controlled in the way that things were controlled when the alternative was considerable. "I want to go to town today," he said. "I want to talk to the attorney. I'd like to come." He looked at her. "This is your hearing." "It's my children," she said. "I'd like to come." He nodded once. 2 hours. She went back to the kitchen and told Bert she'd need the afternoon, which Bert accepted with the equanimity of a man who'd long since stopped being surprised by anything that happened on this ranch. She told Ruth she was going to town, which Ruth accepted with the expression of a 12-year-old who was filing information for later use. In the wagon, on the way to town, they didn't talk much. They were past the point, in some ways, of needing to fill silence. The thing between them, the thing that had been in the kitchen the night of the storm, was still there, somewhere in the space between them on the wagon seat. Neither of them prodded it. What they had was something more functional than romance and, in its own way, more durable. They were two people who had decided, separately and then together, that they trusted each other's judgment. On a frontier, in the middle of a legal fight, that was worth considerably more than softer things. The attorney was a man named Aldous Hale, who had an office above the hardware store, and the reputation of a man who'd seen enough of Langford's dealings to be unimpressed by them. He listened to Evelyn's account with precise attention, asked 6 specific questions, and looked at the notes she'd brought, her own documentation of the household, the witness list, the timeline she'd reconstructed, and the information about Langford's letter to the Land Records Office. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. "You put this together yourself," he said. "Yes." "In the middle of running a ranch kitchen and raising 5 children." "Yes." Aldous Hale looked at his desk for a moment. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I have been practicing law in this territory for 22 years, and I have represented approximately a dozen people whose children were threatened in one form or another by people with money and influence." He paused. "I have never had a client walk into my office with a package like this one." "Is it enough?" she asked. "We have a strong case," he said carefully. "I want you to understand that strong doesn't mean certain. Langford will prepare. He has resources." "I know." "The hearing is in 16 days. He looked at the witness list. "Some of these people, they've all confirmed." He looked up. "All of them?" "Yes," she said. Aldous Hale sat back in his chair and looked at her with the particular expression of a man revising an expectation. "All right," he said. "Let me tell you what we need to do between now and then." Outside, the main street of Redstone Crossing was going about its Tuesday business. Wagons and horses and the ordinary commerce of a frontier town. People walked past the window of Hale's office without looking up. 16 days. The hearing was 16 days away, and for the first time since she'd read the petition by lamplight in the ranch kitchen, Evelyn Harper felt something that wasn't just cold determination. It felt like the beginning of an answer. The 16 days between Aldous Hale's office and the hearing were the longest of Evelyn's life, and she had lived through some long stretches. She moved through them the only way she knew how, by keeping her hands occupied and her mind on the next specific task, and by not allowing herself to spend time in the territory of what might happen, because that territory had no floor and she couldn't afford to fall. Hale had given her a list of things to prepare: character statements from witnesses, written and signed, documentation of the household's finances, her wages, how they were spent, what the children had in terms of clothing, food, medicine, education, a timeline of her employment at the ranch, annotated with specifics. He wanted the Dolan account of Langford's letter to the Land Records Office formalized into a sworn statement, which required a separate trip to town with Nora and her husband that took most of a Thursday. She did all of it. She did it in the hours after the children were asleep and before the kitchen needed her in the morning, at the table with a lantern and her careful handwriting and the discipline of a woman who understood that this particular fight was going to be won or lost on the quality of her preparation. Aldous Hale, reviewing her materials at their second meeting, said, "You missed your calling." "I had 5 children and a farm," she said. "There wasn't room for a calling. I mean it as a compliment." "I know. Thank you." She set another document on his desk. The Mercer statement. And the Garrity widow. She's 73 and she wants to testify in person. I told her that wasn't necessary, but she insists. Hale looked at the Garrity statement. A 73-year-old widow insisting on testifying on your behalf is not a problem, he said. That's an asset. Evelyn thought of old Mrs. Garrity, who lived alone in a small house at the edge of town and received the weekly food parcel from the ranch kitchen without much fanfare. She'd said, the first time Thomas delivered it, only, "About time someone remembered I exist." She was blunt and dry and had opinions about everything, and the thought of her sitting in a courtroom making those opinions known to a judge gave Evelyn something that was almost amusement. "She'll say whatever she wants," Evelyn told Hale. "I can't manage her." "Good," Hale said. "Managed witnesses sound managed. She sounds real." Victor Langford, meanwhile, was not idle. He came to the ranch 3 days before the hearing, not to the kitchen, to the front door, which meant he was making a statement about what kind of visit this was. He asked for Wade, and Wade received him in the front room, which was as far as he was going to get. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She heard the arrival, recognized the voice, and kept working. Thomas gave her a look from his position at the woodpile, visible through the kitchen window. She shook her head slightly. He went back to the woodpile. The conversation in the front room lasted about 20 minutes. She couldn't hear the specific words, only the cadence. Langford's voice smooth and even, Wade's shorter and flatter. No raised voices. That was almost worse than raised voices, in some ways. Wade came to the kitchen afterward. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could read the conversation in the set of his jaw. He offered to drop the petition, Wade said. She set down her work. In exchange for what? The East section, full deed transfer. He'd take the petition away and make sure the Ladies' Civic Society stopped being interested in your situation. His words. The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you tell him?" she asked, though she already knew, because she knew Wade well enough by now to know he hadn't agreed to it. "I told him to get off my property." A pause. "I used different words." She looked at him. "You should have taken more time before answering, for your own sake." "That section is mine," he said, and the simplicity of it closed the subject. "And so is this ranch, and the people on it." He held her gaze for a moment. "I don't sell things to men like Langford." She looked at him long enough that the moment became something slightly more than a practical exchange, and then she looked back at her work. "He'll be prepared in that courtroom," she said. "So will we." She nodded. There was nothing else useful to say about it, so she didn't say anything else. But after Wade left and the kitchen was quiet again, she stood at the counter and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what the next 3 days represented. Not the case, not the preparation, not the strategy, just the fact that someone was trying to take her children. The fact that she was fighting this fight not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because a man needed leverage, and her family had been the most convenient available tool. That feeling didn't last long. She didn't let it. But she let it exist for those few seconds, because denying it entirely required energy she couldn't spare, and because some things deserve to be felt before you put them away. She went back to work. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to her children breathe, and ran through everything she'd prepared and everything Hale had said and everything she knew about how the morning would go. She'd been to one other court proceeding in her life, a property dispute after Harlan's death involving a creditor who'd made claims against the farm. She'd won that one on documentation and stubbornness. She intended to win this one the same way, with the addition of 11 ranch hands, 2 farming families, a 73-year-old widow, and a sworn statement that put a months-old letter in a land records office at the beginning of a chain of events that ended here. She got up at 4 o'clock and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat with it in the dark. Wade was up too. She heard him in the room down the hall, the sounds of a man who'd also found sleep unavailable. After a while, he came to the kitchen. He looked at the coffee and she gestured toward the pot without saying anything, and he poured a cup and sat across from her at the table. They sat in silence for a few minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. They'd gotten good at silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Ruth said something to me yesterday," Wade said. "What did she say?" "She said..." He paused, turned the cup in his hands. "She said that when her father was alive, he used to get up early and sit in the kitchen before the day started. She said she could always tell how hard a day it was going to be by how early he was up." He looked at her. "She said yesterday that she felt better knowing you weren't the only one up early today." Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. "She's observant," she said finally. "She is." He was quiet for a moment. "Your children..." He stopped, started again. "There's something, Evelyn. All 5 of them. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that." She looked up at him. He wasn't a man who said things like that easily. She'd learned that about him over 2 months. When he said something, it had been thought through first. "Thank you," she said. "Wade." She said his name deliberately because she almost always said it formally, and it felt right, this morning, to say it differently. He nodded once. They finished their coffee. The ranch slowly came awake around them. The sounds of the bunkhouse, the horses, the early birds starting up outside. The ordinary sounds of a place with people in it. At 6 o'clock, she got her children up and made them breakfast, and gave Thomas and Ruth very specific instructions about how the younger 3 were to behave in the courtroom, which Thomas accepted with the gravity of a deputy receiving orders and which May received with the focused attention of someone already planning questions. "Don't ask questions," Evelyn told her. "What if I have one?" "You will. Write it in your head and ask me after." May considered this. "What if I forget it?" "May." One word, final. "Yes, ma'am." The hearing was in the Redstone Crossing Courthouse, which was a solid building on the main street that served as courtroom, county records office, an occasional meeting hall depending on the day. By the time Evelyn arrived with her children and Aldous Hale, there were already people there. More people than she'd expected, which meant word had gotten around about the hearing in ways that had nothing to do with her witness list. She saw the Mercer family, the Dolans, old Mrs. Garrity in a chair near the front, wearing her best dress and an expression that suggested she was prepared to outlast everyone in the room on principle. She saw Bert Dawson and Pete and at least 8 of the other ranch hands, uncomfortable in the formal space, but there, present, unambiguous about it. She also saw people she hadn't expected. The woman from the general store who'd crossed to the other side of the street in the early weeks. She was here, sitting in the 3rd row, and when she made eye contact with Evelyn, she didn't look away. A man Evelyn vaguely recognized as a dry goods merchant, and a woman she'd talked to once at the well behind the livery and helped with a loose wheel on her cart. Small things, accumulated over 2 months apparently into something she hadn't been entirely aware of. Wade sat beside her at the plaintiff's table. He hadn't asked if she wanted him there. She hadn't told him she did. He was just there, which was its own kind of statement. Langford came in with 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize, his own attorney, and she guessed someone from the county welfare office who'd been brought in to give the petition an official patina. Langford looked the same as he always looked, measured, well-dressed, projecting the mild confidence of a man who'd been comfortable in rooms like this one for a long time. He glanced at the number of people in the seats, and something very small shifted in his expression. He covered it quickly and sat down. The judge was a man named Solomon Reardon, 60, deliberate, with the face of someone who'd stopped being surprised by human behavior some decades back. He came in, looked at the room, looked at both tables, and sat down. "This is a petition regarding the welfare of 5 minor children currently in the care of one Evelyn Harper," Judge Reardon said. "The petitioner is Victor Langford, representing, he states, the community's concern for said children." He looked at Langford's table. "I've read the petition. I'd like to hear the petitioner's case." Langford's attorney stood. He was smooth, younger than Hale, better dressed, with the particular confidence of a man who billed high rates. He laid out the petition's concerns in careful, measured language. The irregular domestic situation, the absence of established social position, the question of long-term stability for the children. He called it a matter of genuine community concern, and he said the word genuine twice, which was 1 time more than it needed to be. He called 2 witnesses. A woman from the Ladies' Civic Society who described Evelyn's household in terms of questions and concerns without specifying a single actual incident of harm. A county official who spoke about general standards for children's welfare in abstract terms that had nothing specific to do with the Harper children at all. Hale cross-examined both witnesses with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd been waiting for exactly what he got. The Civic Society woman pressed for specifics, had none. The county official, asked whether he'd ever visited the Callahan Ranch or met the Harper children, said he had not. "Thank you," Hale said pleasantly. Nothing further. Reardon's face gave nothing away, but his eyes moved with the careful attention of a man who was tracking more than the words. Hale opened for Evelyn's defense with a simple statement, that the evidence would demonstrate that the petition was not a genuine welfare concern, but a tactic in a commercial dispute, and that the Harper children were not in any distress. They were, in fact, thriving. He called Bert Dawson first. Bert was not a natural witness. He was a man more comfortable with fence posts than courtrooms, and he held his hat in his hands and spoke in short sentences and looked at the floor more than at the room. But short sentences, in this context, had their own authority. He described the ranch kitchen. He described how the Harper children worked, ate, behaved. He described the night of the storm, Evelyn stitching Cy's head, going into the barn, running the kitchen as a crisis response. He said, with the flat certainty of a man stating an observable fact, "Those children are not neglected. They're better provided for than most children I've seen on the frontier." Langford's attorney cross-examined and got nothing useful. Old Pete was next. Pete sat in the witness chair with his hands on his knees and looked at Langford directly for the first 10 seconds, which made Langford look at his notes. And then Pete turned to the judge and said what he'd said to Bert Dawson 3 weeks ago, almost word for word. "That woman has more backbone than any man I've worked beside in 30 years. Anyone trying to say she's not fit for her children needs to come out to that ranch and do what she does for 1 week." A sound ran through the gallery. Not quite laughter, something more like recognition. The Mercer husband testified about the afternoon Evelyn had helped during his youngest child's illness. The Dolan wife testified about the recipe and the conversation and what she'd seen when the storm had caught her at the ranch. Nora's husband, Eli Dolan, testified about the letter, the one Langford had written to the county land records office 5 months before the petition, questioning water rights on the Callahan Ranch's eastern section. This was the moment the room changed. Langford's attorney objected twice, fast, and Judge Reardon overruled both objections with the patience of a man who'd already seen where this was going and intended to let it arrive. Eli Dolan was not a dramatic man. He was a farmer, practical and plain-spoken, and he read from notes he'd written in his own hand because Hale had told him to write down exactly what he'd seen and say exactly that. He described the date, the location, the county office, the document he'd seen on the clerk's desk with Langford's name on the heading requesting a review of water rights in the valley. He described the language, that certain holdings were in legally ambiguous territory. He named the specific section, the eastern grazing land along the creek. The letter existed 5 months before Evelyn Harper had ever arrived in Redstone Crossing. 5 months before there were any children on the Callahan Ranch to be concerned about. The sequence, laid out plainly in a quiet courtroom on a Thursday morning, had the particular impact of simple arithmetic, undeniable, unless you could argue with the numbers themselves. Langford's attorney stood and said, "Your Honor, the existence of a prior business inquiry has no bearing on—" "It has bearing," Judge Reardon said, "on the question of motivation. Sit down, Counselor." The attorney sat. Hale called Nora Dolan. She testified to the storm. She testified to what she'd seen, specific, detailed, the language of a woman who'd been paying attention and knew what she'd observed. When she described Evelyn going into the barn for the horses, she looked at the gallery, not the judge, which meant she was talking to the room as much as the court, and the room was listening. Then Hale called a witness he'd told Evelyn about only the night before, a man named James Whitmore, who was the former clerk at Langford's trading company, who had left Langford's employ 14 months ago under circumstances that had not been elaborated on publicly. Whitmore was in his late 30s, with the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently decided to put it down. He sat in the witness chair and looked at his hands, and then at Hale, and then, once, at Langford, and Langford's expression did not change, but his attorney leaned over and said something in his ear, fast and low. Whitmore testified about a conversation he'd been present for, 14 months ago, in Langford's office, between Langford and a man from the County Welfare Board. A conversation in which Langford had asked, directly, whether a welfare petition could be used as leverage in a commercial property dispute, whether the threat of it or the filing of it could apply pressure to a landowner who was refusing to negotiate. The Welfare Board man, according to Whitmore, had been uncomfortable with the question. He'd said it wasn't the intended purpose of the process. Langford had said that purposes were flexible. Whitmore had left Langford's employ the following month. He hadn't said anything about the conversation because, he said with the flat honesty of someone past pretending, he'd been afraid of what Langford could do to him commercially. He was saying it now because he'd read about the petition in the filing notices and recognized, 14 months later, exactly what it was. The courtroom had the very specific quality of silence that meant everyone in it was processing something at the same time. Langford's attorney cross-examined Whitmore aggressively, questioned his reliability, questioned his motives, questioned the accuracy of his memory. Whitmore didn't waver. He wasn't performing conviction. He was just saying what he'd seen and heard, in the same words each time, and when you couldn't shake the words, you couldn't shake the testimony. Hale called Mrs. Garrity last. She was 73 and she moved slowly, and she sat in the witness chair with the dignity of a woman who had long since stopped caring what anyone in the room thought of her, which was its own form of authority. Judge Reardon looked at her. "Mrs. Garrity, How long have you known the respondent? About 2 months, Mrs. Garrity said. She started sending food to my house about 3 weeks after she arrived at the Callahan Ranch. Didn't ask, didn't announce it, just sent it. She paused. I'm old and I'm alone, and people in this town have been forgetting that for about 5 years. That woman didn't forget. Or maybe she never knew and figured it out. Another pause. Either way, Hale asked her about the Harper children. She described them with the specificity of a woman who'd had occasion to observe them. Thomas helping unload deliveries without being asked. Henry asking her questions about her garden with genuine curiosity. May narrating the names of all the plants while Henry asked his questions, which Mrs. Garrity described as simultaneously exhausting and not entirely unpleasant. And in your opinion, Hale said, are those children being adequately cared for? Mrs. Garrity looked at him as if the question were slightly beneath the dignity of the room. In my opinion, she said, those children have a mother who would walk into a burning barn for them, which I'm told she essentially did in that storm. She looked at the judge. The question you should be asking is not whether those children are cared for. The question is what kind of man files a court petition against a widow's children because he can't close a land deal? Langford's attorney said, objection. Sustained, Judge Reardon said. Mrs. Garrity, please limit your testimony to what you've directly observed. I've observed all of it, Mrs. Garrity said, with the tone of a woman complying with the letter of the instruction while not entirely conceding the spirit. That's all I have to say. She stood up from the witness chair without waiting to be dismissed. Judge Reardon watched her return to her seat and then looked at his notes for a moment. Closing arguments were brief. Hale made his case in the language of sequence and documentation. The letter, the timeline, the absence of any actual evidence of harm to the children, the presence of abundant evidence of a stable and functioning household. He said what he needed to say without excess and sat down. Langford's attorney made an argument that had the sound of a structure still standing after the foundation had been removed. The shapes of the words were right, but there was nothing under them anymore, and the room could feel it. Judge Reardon called a recess. He was gone for 40 minutes. Evelyn sat at the table and did not talk and did not look at the gallery and did not think about what was happening in the room where the judge was sitting with the documents. She looked at her hands on the table. She was aware of Wade beside her, not touching her, not saying anything, just present. Thomas was in the gallery with Ruth and the younger children. She did not look at them. She knew that if she looked at them, she would lose the particular quality of stillness she was maintaining, and she needed it for another 40 minutes. When Judge Reardon came back in, the room stood and then sat and then went very quiet. He looked at his notes. He looked at Langford's table. He looked at Evelyn. I am dismissing this petition, he said, in its entirety. A sound went through the gallery. Not quite a cheer, more like a collective exhale of something that had been held. I am dismissing it, Reardon continued in the voice of a man who had more to say and intended to say it, because it lacks any substantiated basis in the welfare of the children it claims to represent. The respondent has demonstrated, through the testimony of more than a dozen witnesses, that she maintains a stable, organized, and caring household. Her children are healthy, educated within her means, and clearly well loved. He paused. I am also making a formal note in the record of this proceeding that the evidence presented suggests this petition was filed not in the genuine interest of the children named within it, but as an instrument of commercial pressure in a separate dispute. That is an abuse of this court's process. He looked at Langford directly. And I will be noting that in my communication to the county board. Langford met the judge's gaze for a moment and then looked at the table in front of him. Mrs. Harper, Judge Reardon said. Evelyn looked at him. You have built something real, he said, that has been amply demonstrated here today. This court recognizes it. She nodded. She did not trust her voice enough for words, which was not a condition she was accustomed to. The gavel came down. The room came alive around her. She was aware of it. The movement, the voices, Wade standing up beside her, Hale gathering papers, someone in the gallery saying something in a voice that was definitely Bert Dawson. But she sat still for just a moment longer, at the table, with her hands flat in front of her. 43 days since she'd rolled into Redstone Crossing on a wagon with a cracked wheel and $14 and 5 children and no plan except to work hard and tell the truth. She sat with that for a moment. Then she turned around. Thomas was standing just inside the gallery rail. He had Ruth beside him and Henry pressing against his elbow and Clara with her hand in his. May was in front of all of them, just inside the rail, looking at her mother with large brown eyes that were full of a question she hadn't quite formed yet. Evelyn stood up. She walked to her children. May said, "Are we okay?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "We're okay." May thought about this for a moment. "Can I say something now?" "After," Evelyn said, and she put her arms around as many of them as she could reach. Old Mrs. Garrity, making her way past in the aisle, patted Evelyn once on the shoulder without stopping or saying anything. It was the most direct expression of warmth the old woman was apparently capable of, and Evelyn understood it exactly for what it was. Bert Dawson was crying slightly, which he was covering badly by blowing his nose into a handkerchief and looking at the ceiling. Pete stood near the door with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man whose prediction had come true and who had the decency not to say so out loud. Outside the courthouse, in the pale afternoon light of a Thursday in Redstone Crossing, the town that had spent 6 weeks telling a story about Evelyn Harper had to find a different story. Most of them were already working on it. That was the thing about truth. It didn't require everyone to convert at once. It just required enough people to acknowledge it that the other stories stopped having anywhere comfortable to live. Victor Langford came out of the courthouse behind his attorney. He moved through the street with the controlled composure of a man used to setbacks, which this clearly was, but a setback of a particular kind. The kind that left marks. The kind that a judge puts in writing and sends to a county board. He didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't look at him either. They were done with each other, functionally, and they both understood that. Wade came to stand beside her on the courthouse steps. He didn't say anything for a moment. The street was moving around them, ordinary again, a frontier town in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. "The barn repairs are going to cost more than I thought," he said. She looked at him. Something in her chest loosened a fraction. The absurdity of it, the return to the practical, the specific quality of his timing. "I'll look at the supply costs tomorrow," she said. "Good." They stood in the afternoon light, not quite touching, 5 children behind them and a town adjusting itself around them, and Evelyn felt the future in a way she hadn't permitted herself to feel it in 43 days. Not certain, not promised, but present. Real. Something she could put her hands on. That was enough. For today, it was enough. The day after the hearing, Evelyn overslept by 40 minutes. She woke to the sound of the kitchen already in motion. Ruth at the stove, moving with the particular careful competence of a girl who'd been watching her mother work for 2 months and had quietly memorized most of it. Thomas had already gone to the woodpile. Henry was outside doing something that involved the gray cat and a length of rope. May was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of something warm and narrating, at moderate volume, a detailed account of the previous day's court proceedings to no one in particular. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the kitchen in her stocking feet and looked at all of this. "You let me sleep," she said. Ruth didn't look up from the stove. "You needed it." "The men need breakfast by—" "Bert came by an hour ago. He said the men could manage with the cold biscuits from yesterday and that you should sleep. His exact words were—" Ruth paused, clearly selecting. "He said, 'Tell her we're not helpless and she should stay in bed until she's ready.' I'm paraphrasing slightly." Evelyn stood in the doorway for another moment. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a room that had been occupied and tended by people who knew what they were doing. "The eggs will get rubbery if you don't—" "Mama," Ruth looked at her now, with the direct patience of a 12-year-old who had decided something. "Sit down." Evelyn sat down. May immediately redirected her narration toward Evelyn. "I was telling about when Mrs. Garrity said the thing about the burning barn," May said. "I'm at that part. I know what happened. I was there. I know, but I'm telling it." Evelyn looked at her youngest daughter, 4 years old, narrating the world as if it were a story being told specifically for her benefit, which Evelyn supposed, from May's perspective, it was. She thought about May in that ranch kitchen on the first night, holding a piece of iron that was too heavy for her because she'd been asked to hold it. She thought about May on the road, asking in complete seriousness whether they were going to die by the side of the road. "All right," Evelyn said. "Tell it." May told it. Ruth served breakfast. The morning came in through the kitchen windows the way mornings did on the ranch, gradually and without ceremony, the light moving across the floor and the sounds of the ranch assembling themselves into the day's particular rhythm. It was an ordinary morning. Evelyn sat in it and understood that ordinary was what she had fought for, specifically. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, though that had come. Just this. The ordinary weight of a day that belonged to her family. The week after the hearing was strange in the way that weeks after significant events are always strange. Everything continues, the work continues, the meals need cooking, and the fences need checking, and the children need tending, but something underneath the ordinary surface has shifted, and you feel it in the small moments, the ones you weren't watching for. Harriet Crow came to the ranch on the third day. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Bert knocked and said, with a carefully neutral expression, that Mrs. Crow was at the front door and was asking if she might speak with Mrs. Harper. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and went. Harriet Crow stood on the front step in her good dress, which meant she'd planned the visit, which meant she'd thought about it, which meant something. She looked different than she had in the general store 2 months ago. The practiced righteousness was gone, or at least diminished, replaced by something less comfortable and probably more honest. "Mrs. Harper," she said. "Mrs. Crow." A pause. Harriet Crow looked at the middle distance briefly, then back at Evelyn. "I came to say that I should not have signed that petition. I should not have done several things I did over the past 2 months." She said it with the particular effort of someone delivering a speech they'd rehearsed, but were still finding difficult. "I allowed myself to be guided by someone whose motives I understood less well than I believed, and She stopped. "I had already formed opinions about your situation before I knew anything real about it. That was wrong of me." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. She'd thought about this conversation, in the abstract, about what she'd say to the people who'd worked against her when they eventually needed to address it. She'd imagined saying several things, some of them satisfying in a way that wouldn't have been useful. What she said was, "I appreciate you coming to tell me that." Harriet Crow nodded. The tension in her shoulders released a fraction. "I also wanted to say," she paused again, "my daughter. She's 16 and she wants to learn how to properly manage a household, how to cook, how to run an account. Not from a book." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I was wondering if you might be willing to teach her. I would compensate you for your time." Evelyn hadn't expected that. She looked at Harriet Crow and understood that this was the apology in its fullest form. Not just the words, but the ask, which required trust from a woman who'd spent 2 months investing in the opposite of trust. "Send her on Saturdays," Evelyn said. "She can work in the kitchen with Ruth. I won't charge you." Harriet Crow opened her mouth, then closed it. "That's very generous. It's practical," Evelyn said. "Ruth could use someone her own age to work with. Your daughter could use something real to learn." She paused. "We'll see how it goes." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Evelyn wasn't sure forgiveness was the right frame for it. It suggested something more final, more resolved than what was actually possible. What it was a door left open. That was different, and it was what she could honestly offer. Harriet Crow left. Evelyn went back to the kitchen. Ruth, who had heard most of it from her position near the kitchen window, was looking at her mother with an evaluating expression. "Her daughter is probably nothing like her," Ruth said. "Probably not," Evelyn agreed. "How do you know?" "I don't. That's why she's coming on Saturday." Ruth considered this. It seemed to satisfy her in some way she didn't fully articulate, and she went back to her work. Victor Langford left Redstone Crossing 12 days after the hearing. He didn't make an announcement of it. One day he was present, and the following week his offices were being managed by an associate, and the word in town was that he'd relocated to pursue interests in another territory. The trading company remained under different management, but Langford himself was gone. Evelyn heard this from Gus Fielding at the general store, who told her in the tone of a man delivering information he thought she'd want without making a production of it. "Thought you'd want to know," Gus said. "Thank you, Gus." "My wife made that cornbread again last Sunday," he said, which was as close as Gus Fielding got to a personal statement about anything. "How did it come out?" "She put dried cherry in it," Said it was your idea. I suggested it as an option. She claims she invented it. He said this with the flat tone of a husband who had long since learned which claims were worth contesting. Then she invented it, Evelyn said. Gus's expression did something small and warm. He went back to his inventory. The east section of the Callahan Ranch stayed in Wade's possession, naturally, since there'd been no valid legal challenge to it. Only the threat of one, which had collapsed in the same courtroom as everything else Langford had built. The water rights question went to the county board, which, having received Judge Reardon's formal note about the abuse of the court's process, reviewed the matter and found nothing irregular in the existing arrangement. Wade told Evelyn this over the kitchen table one evening, in the same tone he might report on the condition of the north pasture. "So that's settled," she said. "That's settled." She nodded. "I've been thinking about the kitchen stores for winter," she said. "We need to start preserving earlier than I did last year. I want to set aside 3 weeks in September for Evelyn." He said her name with a specificity that made her stop and look at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen in the kitchen the night of the storm, the one that existed in the margins, that neither of them had addressed. She waited. "I want to say something," he said, and then appeared to have some difficulty with the next part, which was, she found, somewhat against her expectations, not irritating but human in a way she recognized. She'd watched this man handle damaged barns and difficult horses and legal threats with the same deliberate competence. This was different. This was the thing that was harder than any of those things, for people like them. "Then say it," she said, not unkindly. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "I'm not good at this, saying things of this kind." "I know. Say it anyway." "You came here with nothing, and you built something," he said. "And it's not just the kitchen or the household, though those things matter. It's that the ranch is different since you've been here." He stopped. "I'm different." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not ready to be," he said. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. He stopped again, and she could see the frustration of a man who was precise and deliberate with most things, and was finding this particular territory imprecise in a way he couldn't resolve through effort. "I didn't want to keep not saying it. It seemed dishonest to keep not saying it." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the early evening sounds of the ranch were settling into their particular rhythms. The horses, the distant sound of the bunkhouse. Somewhere the gray cat Henry had befriended doing whatever cats did in early evening. Evelyn had thought about this, not in the way you planned a speech, but in the way you thought about something that was present in the background of your ordinary days. Something you were aware of, that you'd been circling at a careful distance because the distance felt responsible. She told herself the distance was responsible. She was a widow with 5 children at a man's ranch, in a town that had already made up stories about what that meant. She'd told herself that whatever she felt, whatever the kitchen after the storm had held, whatever the coffee in the dark before the hearing had meant, she needed to be careful. She told herself she was tired and that tired people made decisions for the wrong reasons. All of that was true, and none of it was the complete truth. The complete truth was that she'd been afraid. Not of him, of the thing itself, of needing someone again, of building something that depended on another person's continued presence, when she knew with the specific knowledge of experience exactly how completely a person could be present and then not be. Harlan's death hadn't made her hard. It had made her careful. And careful was its own kind of loss if you weren't paying attention. "I came here with nothing," she said. "That's true. And I built something. That's also true." She looked at him directly. "But I built it on a foundation that wasn't mine. The kitchen, the roof over my children's heads, the wages, those were yours. You made a choice that night at the gate that made everything else possible." "You would have found another way," he said. "Maybe. I'd like to think so, but you were the way that was actually there." She paused. I've been careful about this, what I feel, what it means, because I know what it costs when you let yourself depend on something and then it's gone." "I'm not planning on going anywhere," he said. "I know. It's not about planning." She looked for the words and found them in the rough form they'd taken in her mind over the past weeks. "It's about choosing. Choosing to let something matter. choosing to build towards something instead of just around it. She looked at him. I'm not there yet. I want to be honest about that. But I'm not there either. Wade Callahan looked at her for a long moment. That's the most qualified yes I've ever heard, he said. She looked at him, and then, because she was tired and because it was accurate and because she realized not afraid of this particular man in the way she'd been afraid of the general idea. She laughed. A real one, short and slightly surprised by itself, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere you'd forgotten was still there. He didn't laugh. He wasn't a man who laughed easily, but something in his face shifted into the nearest territory, and it was enough. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a declaration. It was more like two careful people acknowledging that they were both standing on the same ground and had decided deliberately to stay there, which was, for people like them, both the beginning and the most important part. The weeks that followed had a different quality than anything that had come before. Not easier, necessarily. The ranch was always work. The children were always work, and the frontier in winter was its own particular set of problems. Bert Dawson's back gave out in November and needed 2 weeks of management adjustment. Clara got sick again, a real illness this time, that kept Evelyn at her bedside for 3 nights running until the fever broke, and the doctor from town came out and confirmed what Evelyn had already known, that the worst had passed and the child was coming back. Thomas turned 15 in October and was, by consensus of the ranch hands, given his own specific set of duties alongside the men, which he accepted with the attempt at dignity of a boy who was trying very hard not to show that it mattered to him enormously. Ruth started teaching Harriet Crow's daughter on Saturdays. The girl's name was Eleanor, and she was, as Ruth had predicted, nothing like her mother. She was shy and precise, and laughed at unexpected things, and within 3 weeks had become as close to a friend as Ruth had had since before her father died. Evelyn watched them working side by side in the kitchen on Saturday mornings and understood that some of the things that had been closing off in Ruth were opening again, slowly, in the specific way that things open when they're ready and not before. May turned 5 in December, which she regarded as a major developmental milestone and celebrated with the full intensity of a person for whom every occasion was an occasion. She received from Pete a small braided rope that he'd made for her specifically, which she carried everywhere for a month. Henry learned to ride properly, not just to be on a horse, but to ride, under the instruction of Bert Dawson during Bert's recovery, when Bert had time to sit on a fence rail and direct, and not much else. It turned out that teaching suited Bert, which surprised Bert, and no one else. Evelyn cooked. She managed the kitchen and the household and the accounts and the stores. She preserved 3 weeks of food in September as she'd planned. She expanded the kitchen garden in the spring, which was the first deliberate act of planning for a future she was allowing herself to acknowledge. A garden was a statement. A garden said you were going to be here when the harvest came. She and Wade built something that was harder to name than a garden but similar in structure. Slow, deliberate, requiring consistent attention, producing things that didn't look like much at any individual moment but accumulated into something substantial over time. They argued about the ranch accounts in February, which was the first real argument, and it was a real one. She thought he was undervaluing the kitchen operation in the ledger, which had implications for how he made decisions about supplies. He thought she was overcomplicating a system that had worked fine for 20 years. They were both partly right, which took them 3 days to arrive at, and during those 3 days they were professionally civil in the specific way of two people who disagreed seriously and weren't pretending otherwise. When they resolved it, a new accounting system that incorporated her approach without discarding his, Wade said, "You're not easy to argue with." "You're not easy to argue with either," she said. "Is that a problem?" She considered it genuinely. "No," she said. "I think it's probably the opposite." He nodded once. That was enough. In the spring, she walked the east section of the ranch for the first time. Along the creek, through the grazing land that Langford had wanted badly enough to manufacture a case against her children. It was beautiful in the specific, unshowy way of frontier land, wide and flat and crossed by water, with the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of things going about their business at a register humans weren't always equipped to hear. Thomas walked with her. He'd grown another inch since autumn and was developing, she noticed, the walk of a man. Not the self-conscious swagger of a boy trying to seem older, but the actual settled gait of someone who'd been doing real work and whose body knew it. "Do you like it here?" she asked him. She didn't specify where. She meant all of it, the ranch, the territory, the shape that their life had taken. Thomas was quiet for a moment, which was how he answered serious questions. "It's not what I thought it would be," he said. "When we left Millbrook." "What did you think?" "I thought—" He looked at the creek. "I don't know. I thought it would be harder to be the man of the family." He paused. "Not that I thought I was doing it, but I felt like I was supposed to try to be because Papa was gone." He looked at her sideways. "It's better now, not having to try to be that." She walked beside him for a moment. "You were never supposed to be the man of the family. You're 14, 15. You're supposed to be a boy." "I know that now." He was quiet again. "Wade doesn't try to be Papa. He's just there. That's different." "Yes," she said. "It is." "Ruth said she thinks it's going to work out." Another pause. "Between you and Wade." "Ruth said that. She says you're both too stubborn to fail at anything you actually commit to." He said this with the flat delivery of someone quoting directly. Evelyn walked in silence for a moment. Somewhere in the creek, a bird was making noise about something. The spring grass was coming in patchy and yellow-green the way spring grass did. Not the vivid ideal of it, but the actual thing, working its way up through the dirt with the ordinary persistence of living things. "She's probably right," Evelyn said. Thomas nodded, satisfied. They walked the rest of the creek line in comfortable silence, mother and son, and the land opened up around them in every direction. There is a particular kind of woman the frontier produces, or maybe just reveals, because she was always there, in every generation, under every set of circumstances. The kind who does not ask whether she is capable of something before she does it. The kind who assesses the problem, identifies what she has available, and begins. The kind whose toughness is not the brittle kind that cracks under pressure, but the ductile kind that bends without breaking and keeps the essential shape. Evelyn Harper was not exceptional in the way that stories sometimes make people exceptional, with some special gift or destined quality that set her apart from the ordinary run of human beings. She was a woman who cooked well, and worked hard, and loved her children, and was afraid of things, and was afraid of them anyway, and did what needed doing, and sometimes got it wrong and corrected course and kept going. That was all. That was the whole of it. And that, if you look at it plainly, is more than enough. It is, in fact, exactly enough. The world has a way of making that seem insufficient, of suggesting that ordinary determination and ordinary love and ordinary competence are not the stuff of anything meaningful. That meaningful things require exceptional people. But most meaningful things are built exactly the way Evelyn built hers. One meal at a time, one decision at a time, one early morning and one difficult conversation, and one refusal to run when running would have been easier. Stone by stone and season by season, by someone who wasn't sure it would work but was building anyway, because what else do you do? She arrived at that ranch gate with nothing but what she knew how to do and the willingness to do it. She left, not leaving, staying, which was itself a different kind of arriving, with a home. Not a perfect one, not a resolved one, in the sense that life is ever fully resolved. The accounts still argued back sometimes. The barn still needed finishing. Ruth was 12 and would be 13 and then 16, and there would be things ahead that were hard and things that were harder and things that were completely unexpected, which was the nature of children. May would always talk at full volume. Henry would probably always climb things he shouldn't. Clara would have other illnesses, other recoveries, and Evelyn would be there for all of it. Not because fate arranged it, not because something intervened on her behalf, because she walked up to a gate and demanded to be given a chance, and she worked hard enough to deserve the answer she got, and she refused to let a man's greed become the definition of her children's future. That spring, on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was quiet and the older children were occupied and May was asleep in the sun on the porch, with the gray cat, as if this were a perfectly reasonable place for a nap, Wade came and sat beside Evelyn on the porch steps. He had something in his hand. Not a ring, nothing that formal, not yet. A small piece of worked silver, a brooch that had belonged to his mother, which he'd been carrying in his shirt pocket for 3 weeks with no clear plan about when to produce it. He looked at it, He looked at her. "I'm not doing this with a speech," he said. "Good," she said. He held it out. She looked at it for a moment, the small, plain, real thing in his hand, and took it. "I'm still not all the way there," she said. It was honest. It was where she was. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be. But I'm closer than I was." "I know that too." She turned the brooch over in her fingers. It was simple, not elaborate, not showy, the kind of thing made to last. She thought of Harlan briefly, the way she always thought of him, not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with the quieter acknowledgement of a loss that had become part of the structure of things, present and permanent, and no longer only painful. He had been real, and he had loved her, and he was gone, and she was still here, which was the most ordinary and the most enormous fact of her life. And she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to hold both parts of it at the same time. She put the brooch in her own pocket. Wade nodded once, which was enough. May woke up on the porch, looked at both of them, with the alert intensity of a child who sensed something had happened but wasn't sure what, and said, "What did I miss?" "Nothing much," Evelyn said. "Something," May said with certainty. "Something small," Wade said. May evaluated this. "Can I see?" "Later," Evelyn said. May lay back down on the porch boards with the gray cat and resumed her nap, apparently satisfied with this answer. The afternoon held them there on the steps. The ranch, the spring light, the sounds of the territory going about its business. Not a perfect scene, not a finished one. One where the barn still needed work and the accounts needed checking, and there were 5 children and 11 men and 1 woman and 1 man, and a long, unresolved, ongoing, ordinary life to be lived, which was the only kind worth fighting for. She had fought for it. She had it. She intended to keep it. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And it was, without question, enough.